strategy, in part, has been offering their sophisticated, AI-driven, big data, surveillance, and censorship model to the rest of the world. This is because Xi Jinping believes that whoever dominates the digital world dominates the material world. My name is Valerie Shen, and I lead Third Way's National Security Program. We have an amazing group of speakers with breathtaking expertise and dedication, and a fascinating program. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us, and to those watching through DoD or Third Way's live stream. And a special thanks to Team Third Way for their outstanding efforts to make this event happen, especially to Jason Browder, our Senior Policy Advisor for National Security, who you'll be hearing from more during our panel. Third Way's digital world order. What does that mean? This new initiative is about how it is absolutely essential for the U.S. and our like-minded allies to set the digital world order grounded in our core democratic values if we are to have a stable, secure, democratic-led planet in the 21st century. This initiative will propose and further ideas so that the contest between digital democracies and digital authoritarianism is won by our open worldview. Right now, the outcome is unclear. Many countries are taking China's tech, with all of its authoritarian strings attached. Why? It's easier when there's simply no democratic alternative. With Huawei 5G infrastructure, the choice for many was to accept China's rules or just not have high-speed wireless internet. That's part of China's plan. China's propaganda apparatus pushes the narrative that U.S. democracy and other democracies are too dysfunctional and too messy to work in the 21st century. That is also part of their plan. The U.S. will need to dig deep, figure out, agree upon, and then execute our own plan to win. The whole of government, big tech, businesses, civil society, and yes, even Democrats and Republicans passing laws together, and ideally starting as soon as possible. There is no easy, obvious path forward to preserve the liberal world order we've grown accustomed to. The U.S.-China relationship is unavoidably complicated. To compete, but also to avoid unnecessary conflict, maintain peace, and work on transnational issues of mutual interest, such as nuclear nonproliferation and climate change. But if we lean into our American strengths of innovation, determination, and global leadership, if we can be the country that won the space race and invented the internet, and if we are the country that rallied the free world to defend Ukraine's sovereignty and democracy, we can win. That is why I'm excited to be leading this U.S.-China program with a commitment by. I'm also excited as a second-generation Taiwanese American because I believe a deeper understanding of the Chinese language, culture, and history is a crucial piece to passing this difficult geopolitical test. For example, the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is 卧虎藏龙 in Mandarin, literally, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. But a much better contextual translation would be people of hidden extraordinary talent. Mandarin uses many metaphors, idioms imbued with meaning over thousands of years of history and literature. This idiom comes from an ancient poem. 暗时以藏虎, 盘根是卧龙, or there's probably a tiger hiding behind that rock, and those roots resemble a crouching. The takeaway is that beings of immense power can be nearby, but hidden or unnoticed. In the movie, 3 women of exceptional fighting skill are oppressed by their gender roles or conceal their abilities from the unsuspecting. As a national security, we are constantly missing the full context and layers of meaning. Our understanding, communications, and strategy can only suffer going forward. As an Asian American, and with the ongoing rise of violent anti-Asian hate crimes, which I don't imagine will improve as China comes more into public focus, I also feel strongly that Asian Americans have a special role to serve their country, and particularly that Asian American women and men take visible leadership roles. That is why I'm so grateful that fellow Chinese American and my predecessor at Third Way, Mieke Eoyang, will be sharing her expertise on our panel. In 1949, all my grandparents fled for their lives from the Chinese Communist Party. My grandmother, Nai Nai, at the age of 28, took her infant and 5 other children on a refugee boat to Taiwan. The deck was so crowded and chaotic that the woman standing next to her accidentally smothered her infant to death. Nai Nai passed last year at the age of 100, and at her funeral, my aunts and uncles spoke of the sheer will and determination she needed to get all 6 of her children safely across. My parents were later born in Taiwan and immigrated to the U.S., where I was born. Nai Nai immigrated with them and took care of me growing up. And I never really learned English, so maybe others would disagree. But to me, she was the embodiment of the American spirit and the freedom our country stands for. So I believe deeply that this global competition is not about speaking English or Mandarin, East versus West, your ethnicity, religion, culture, or what holidays you celebrate. It's about your values and what world you want your children and their children to live in, with freedom of speech, expression, human rights, privacy, and security. To quote a great man, the late Chairman Elijah Cummings, would often remind us, his staff, that, quote, "We are in a fight for the soul of our democracy, to keep it intact for generations yet unborn." He was focused on the fight at home, but I think he'd agree that it's also true for the fight abroad. Thank you. Now it is my great honor and privilege to welcome to the stage 2 highly distinguished guests and leaders on U.S. national security policy. So I'd like to just start out by asking both of you about the stakes that our U.S.-China competition has and the urgency for the United States to win it in both the digital and technological spaces.
First of all, great to be here with Third Way, and really appreciate your opening remarks. I think you set the tone just right in terms of what you described. But, we are undergoing as a society, as an economy, a huge digital transformation. This is going to define how we compete in the world generally, but also will have huge national security implications. And so it's really a critical moment where we need to do everything possible to keep on the cutting edge of technology, but also to show up in the world and help to shape the international norms that are going to define digital governance. The danger is that if we fail to do that, several things could happen. There's a danger of China exporting its authoritarian model, which includes a number of things: surveillance, censorship of media and social media, state control of the internet access, digital walls or firewalls, even the use of social credit scores, which have been used to control populations, expropriation of sensitive data and IP, versus a democratic model that would enshrine all of the values There's also a danger that if we don't compete, Chinese hardware, Chinese software will become the backbone of the global digital infrastructure. And that could be used for exploitation and also cyber espionage. And there's actually I'm so sorry about this, but there's actually the even greater danger of proliferation of disinformation designed to undermine democracy, portray it as feckless, weak, dysfunctional, etc., divide us from our allies, and influence the domestic public opinion. So the stakes here are really, really high, as you said. And I believe that whoever sets the global digital order, the rules of the road, will really have tremendous leverage diplomatically, economically, and militarily, because this competition that we're in will be waged as much in the information sphere as any other.
And Mac, do you have anything to add?
I agree with everything Michèle said, which is always a good place to start. I think in the piece that y'all wrote, Valerie, you said that this is a competition between two systems, autocracy and democracy. Some people are uncomfortable saying it's a new Cold War and there are clearly differences, but there are two sides. And that competition or adversarial relationship will manifest itself in a number of ways, but the digital domain is one of the key ones. And there is nothing we do virtually in national security that does not have a digital dimension. But our economy is also dependent upon digital information. Our personal lives are dependent upon it. So as Michèle was saying, it goes to our values and how we function as a society. And if China were to become the digital superpower, all of those things would be at risk.
So, first I'll pose this hypothetical. If China were to become the world's digital superpower, what kinds of threats would you be most concerned of, or do you think would have the largest impact on our everyday lives as Americans?
Well, I would start out by going back to this surveillance technology that is important for China to control their own population, but also they are exporting it to more and more countries, which obviously allows those countries to use those repressive methods, but it's also tentacles from Beijing that reach into South America or Africa or other parts of the globe. So if you look at the bigger picture, I think this approach and the technology that goes with it to digital surveillance, giving people scores on how much you criticize the government, et cetera, I think that's a huge issue. I've got to point out, though, and I'll hate to quote him, but Putin, I think, is reported to have said, whoever controls AI controls the world. Certainly it is going to be, it is already important, it will be even more important to a functioning military, to a functioning economy. And so you just pick these examples of where being the digital superpower gives you a tremendous advantage, not in a one-on-one competition, but your system, your approach is going to overwhelm the other. That's the way I would think of the danger.
I would just add, if we characterize this as a race, China is winning right now. They are actually ahead of the U.S. and the West. And what are they doing? They're exporting cheaper telecommunications infrastructure, systems like Huawei to much of the world, not only to create that physical infrastructure and dependency on it, but also to spread the infrastructure that they would use to provide tools of surveillance to other countries, but also tools of espionage for Beijing. They are showing up in force at international fora where internet standards are being set. They actually have given a name to this initiative, the China Standards 2035 project, as you noted in your written materials. And we are not showing up in the kind of way that we need to be effective yet. I think this administration aspires to do that. They're integrating these digital offerings into their core diplomacy. So think of a digital Belt and Road Initiative. So they're trying to gain leverage and influence in various developing countries around the world in key regions where usually there's some kind of economic interest for the Chinese as well. They're doing that with digital offerings. And they're also continuing to steal and setting up the infrastructure to continue to steal billions of dollars in Western intellectual property, to continue to conduct surveillance and espionage using digital means. So what the U.S. really needs right now is to, first of all, have a national strategy and build a coalition of like-minded states to have a strategy and start competing with the Chinese, not necessarily symmetrically in the same way that they're doing it, but asymmetrically in ways that play to our own strengths.
So Michèle, in a November 2021 Washington Post event on digital transformation of the military, you talked about how the U.S. was the best military in the world, and we've thought of ourselves as that, but if we simply rested on our laurels, that won't remain the case. And so we have to invest in new technologies, operational concepts, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing business if we're going to keep our edge. And I feel like you already partially answered that question, but is that also your current assessment of what's going on, that we are resting on our laurels? And if that's the case, what needs to happen to really move us out of that space?
Yeah. No, I think, we are the place where the internet was born. We have this unrivaled innovation ecosystem in Silicon Valley and Austin and, Route 128 around various places around the country. We, are the world's premier cyber power. We have a lot of things where we tell ourselves we are the best in the world. But if we stand still and we don't make the necessary investments in technology, in people, in concepts, in approaches, we won't stay that way. And particularly when it comes to the military domain, which is what I know best, China and Russia and other powers have gone to school on our way of warfare. Ever since the first Gulf War, they've spent 20 plus years investing in ways of countering our conventional superiority. Some of those ways are in the digital, in the cyber, in the AI domain. And again, if we don't, and with authoritarian systems, they sometimes have better success of accelerating the scaling of new technologies than we do, where the Pentagon still struggles to buy commercial technologies and integrate them at speed and at scale. So we have a lot of work to do that we can go through a whole bunch of different recommendations, but we have a lot of work to do to kind of get out of our own way, to be able to fully leverage the strength, the innovation strength that we have and the technical strength we have in this country.
So, Meg, I know you've worked a great deal about trying to give the U.S. military edge, keeping its edge in technology, trying to get over, I think you both spoke of the valley of death. So for those who don't know, maybe you can speak a little bit to that, and where are we with that, and how can we fully utilize our private sector to make sure our military has the best innovation possible?
Yeah, well, really it takes off exactly what Michèle was talking about. So we have the most innovative private sector in the world. The challenge is, too often, it's hard for them to do business with the government. And so the valley of death generally refers to initial funding that will try something out or build a prototype, but then because of the delays in our system, before it can be taken up by one of the military services, this often small, innovative company is just left there with people to payroll to make, and trying to figure out how they're going to survive until the government gets its act together in 2 or 3 or 5 fiscal years in order to give them funds so that they can build a bunch of whatever it was. So and there are different valleys, but I think the broader point is we have tremendous capability, but we still make it too hard for the private sector to do business with government. We focus mainly on DoD, but it's true across the government. And I'd say one other thing kind of related to that is because we believe in limited government, we tend to think, okay, that's the government's job, and this is the private sector job, and this is individuals. The Chinese don't think that way. it's not just a whole of government approach, it's a whole of nation approach. And I'm not saying we should be like them, but I am saying when it comes to some of these cyber and digital areas, it is a question of national security. It's also a question of economic security and individual rights. And we can't afford to think in silos. We're going to have to understand that these things cross domains, even though that's not really our tradition.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes it's really, the government doesn't have to put all of the capital on the table to fund everything, but the government needs to be able to send a clear signal that this is something that we need, then we will be buying. They need to place some big bets. They can, whether it's bridging the valley of death to help companies get to full-scale production of a new capability, or whether it's placing some research and development bets or creating funding. The CHIPS Act is a great example of a big bet. We want to diversify and grow more American capacity for manufacture of semiconductors. Another one could be, we should be investing at the same kind of, well, not the same level, but a substantial level, to create a competitive multi-cloud ecosystem, meaning, because everything is going to be in the cloud in the future. And we are tending to favor one or two big companies. We need a really healthy ecosystem, and government can appropriate monies and guide how those monies are spent in a way that gives us much more resilient ecosystem of players, much as we have done on commercial space. You have a really, increasingly robust and resilient commercial space industry because of how people like Mac and others on the Armed Services Committees and elsewhere seeded that area with some government funding, and then that government funding drew private capital based on that signal.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about bipartisanship, because we have a Democrat and Republican sitting here on stage with us. So U.S. policy on competing with China seems to be perhaps one of the few remaining areas of major bipartisan agreement. But given just how divisive our politics are these days, I don't think progress is a foregone conclusion. So what do you both see as the greatest challenges or opportunities going forward for bipartisan work?
You live this. I'm going to let you start.
Oh, thanks. No, Michèle's right. I think there is no real difference in the parties on how they see the threat from China right now, and that's a good place to start. There are always going to be fringe elements in both parties that dissent, but the challenge is for the broad center of the country to and of the Congress and of political opinion to stay together. And going back to the example Michèle gave a while ago, I think the CHIPS Act is a really good example. Okay, we understand because of COVID and now the Ukraine that we're vulnerable because we can't domestically, we don't have a reliable supply of chips. I mean, obviously concerned about what percentage Taiwan provides. So we're going to do something about it because relatively few bills get passed these days. It becomes a wish list and everybody starts putting everything on it. But in recent days, the leadership in Congress is saying, hey, we got to pare this down, just do the essential part that we can agree upon, which, by the way, will fund something that was authorized a year and a half ago. So could have done a little sooner. But pare it down, do what we can agree on, and move forward. And if that's our approach, it's going to require some political restraint. You're not going to get exactly what you want when you want it, but emphasizing the importance of cohesion and doing something, I think that is a really promising way forward. And this is not the subject here, but you can kind of see that happening with the gun bill that the Senate's working at. So maybe there's some momentum going to, okay, these problems are too big, too important to just completely ignore. We can't fix them all with one bill, but maybe there's some momentum to at least do some things.
I think it's important to instill a sense of urgency here, because the train has left the station in terms of, from Beijing's perspective. They are out there executing on a strategy, and we have got to have a clear strategy that we are executing on as well. And I personally believe that there's going to be a real moment of danger in this competition where a lot of the investments we are making, particularly on the military side, in new capabilities and new technologies, are going to become manifest in the 2030s. I think right now Xi Jinping is pretty preoccupied with, his mishandling of COVID, the slowing down of the economy, the upcoming party Congress. But at some point, when he gets through all that, he's going to start thinking about Taiwan and how he wants to pursue Taiwan. He'll try political coercion, he'll try economic coercion, he'll try shrinking Taiwan's international space. But at the end of the day, this is a legacy issue for him. This is a must-do issue for him. And if he decides that I've got to use force, it's my last resort, but I have to use military force, he may look and say, if I wait, the longer I wait, the harder this is going to be for me, because U.S. capability is only growing. So we have a near to mid-term deterrence problem. And so to me, that translates into really accelerating some of these digital capabilities to make sure that we can asymmetrically use our technological edge to cast doubt on the Chinese mind on whether they could be successful and how costly this would be. So this is key not only on the economic and diplomatic front, this is key to actually deterring a war in Asia, in my view. Not to overstate it, but I really believe that to be true.
So you talked about this, the problem we have in the near short term of deterrence, and I just want to follow up and ask you, what would success look like? What would the right amount of acceleration to be sufficient, not sufficient, but certainly be in a much better place? What would need to look different, be different, I guess, in the country?
Well, I would say, first of all, we've got to define what is the democratic alternative to the Chinese model. And then we have to develop a strategy for really engaging like-minded states to accelerate its adoption or the sharing of that model internationally. Rule number one has to be actually showing up at these international fora where the future rules of the internet and rules of the road for digital governance are being decided. And we need to show up in force with our allies, arm in arm, alongside us. I was pleased that the administration has just nominated a first-time ever ambassador for cybersecurity and emerging technologies. I hope that he will get bipartisan support for a speedy confirmation, because that's really, really key for us showing up. We need to elevate the digital aspects of our diplomacy more broadly. It needs to be a key component of what we're offering, collaboration in the digital domain, whether it's digital trade treaties or provision of digital offerings. We need to really up our game there. And then we need to also invest in more cost-competitive, higher-performing alternatives to what China's offering. Huawei can't be the only viable alternative for these countries. And that will be led by the private sector, but again, it can be incentivized and helped along by targeted government incentives and investment. And then, I think on the military side, there's a huge transformation that's necessary to really move us into the cloud, a secure cloud environment, and to create a resilient network of networks where we can share information, control information, protect information that really will give our decision makers huge advantage in both quality of information and to support their decisions and speed of decision. That will give us a tremendous advantage and kind of underwrite everything else in the future.
Yeah, I would say we already talked about resilient supply chains are important, and pursuing for critical technologies, whether it's chips or strategic minerals or whatnot, we need to pursue that. But not just make sure that we make them within the 50 states, but have our allies as a part of this resilient, reliable supply chain. And that's a kind of a different way of thinking about it than we have traditionally done, but I think it's crucial. We can't do everything ourselves. We need to have that. We've also already talked about the importance of making it easier to bring all the players on the field from the private sector to participate in government. Another aspect of working with allies is to update our export policies. So we can make the best stuff in the world, but if we can't get it into the hands of allies and partners in a timely way, they're going to go where they can get it, and too often that's China. Michèle mentioned the Huawei telecommunications example. I think there are a lot where we are really hurting ourselves and our ability to compete with China by making it so difficult and so long to export things. Final thing I would say is nothing is as important as getting our act together here at home. And we can talk about education and training. We can talk about economic measures, all of which are very important. But it's not a coincidence, I think, that the focus of Russian disinformation has been to inflame controversial issues because they see the more we're divided, the better off they are. And the Chinese are watching and following that playbook too. So it's a matter of national security, economic security, that we get our act together here at home too.
So my personal thinking is that, we're going to be in competition with China for quite a while going forward. And as I sort of mentioned before, they have, as you've mentioned, they have many plans on many different levels. For more of the long term, do you have thoughts on, what the U.S. long-term plan should be, over the course of decades, and how we can begin thinking of how to really operationalize a plan, or even come up with a plan that can generate some level of consensus, like a long-term strategy? Any thoughts on that?
I would just say, in a way, the plan is to make our system work. We talked before, there are some inherent advantages that an autocracy has in trying to mobilize its resources and make things happen in the short term. But they have inherent disadvantages too. And so if you're talking about the long-term plan, it's to be consistent with our values, consistent with our fundamental principles, but also update those things to reflect digital technology, things that move at the speed of light, having a more challenging, diverse competitor, adversary than we've ever had before in our history. So I don't know that we need to take off on a Stalin-like 5 or 10 year plan. Our system has great advantages. We just need to make them work. And as I say, kind of get our own house more in order.
I agree. But I think if we could set a few key priority outcomes to guide us. One is we want international standards that maintain a free, open, and more secure internet. There's some tension inside that, but I think a set of norms that are broadly recognized, with maybe China or Russia or a few others being the exception. But most of countries sign on to a set of digital norms that reflect our shared sense of values. That's one. Number two, maintaining our economic edge in terms of being able to compete across the digital domain in terms of our offerings, our products, our services. And so no country is left with the choice of, well, I can only go with China because that's the only option I have. And then on the military side, ensuring that we keep our edge not only in the cyber domain, but in this broader data and information utilization domain. And that includes probably AI as well, and ethical use of AI. And so, I think that's, there's just it's a very, and you could probably come up with other outcomes, but I think if we articulated 3, 4, 5 outcomes that are absolutely critical to really the global order and what kind of world we're all going to be living in the coming century, we could align a strategy behind that.
So now I think we're ready to maybe take a few questions from the audience. for our guests here, and there's a microphone somewhere. So if you want to raise your hands, and I'll how about in the back over there?
Hi, thank you so much. My question is, what is the role of Asian Americans as we compete with China? I think Valerie said something about that earlier, but as a Chinese American myself, I always, in doing national security work, competing with China can oftentimes be seen as, not trusting Chinese Americans. So yeah, just want your thoughts about how we should be treating and thinking about involving Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in the competition in China.
Can you share just your name and where you're from?
My name is Siyu Mo, and I am from San Francisco, and but I'm actually a fellow for Senator Mark Warner.
Great. So I would say, the diversity of our population in the United States and the fact that we are, in at least in part, a nation of immigrants, should be a source of tremendous strength. The truth is we have many, many Americans who have the linguistic capability, the cultural familiarity, the experience abroad or with family abroad who actually can give us tremendous insight to understand a big question like, what will it take to deter China? Each country, each culture has a different set of views of how they look at the world, how they calculate strategic risk. What worked with the Soviet Union or with Putin's Russia doesn't necessarily work with Xi's, China. And so we should be leveraging that. And it's one of the areas that I think we've really gotten it backwards sometimes. And even if on a more practical level, on the economic side, if you look at Silicon Valley, and you look at the founders of those companies that define that innovation ecosystem, half of them are either immigrants or first-generation Americans. We literally cannot innovate and compete on a global scale without drawing the world's best talent and encouraging people to make their lives here and pursue the American dream here. And that means some fundamental changes to our immigration and visa processes, frankly, if we're really going to leverage that strength, that attractive strength that we have as America for competing with China in the future.
Yeah, we need all the players on the field. Diversity is a tremendous strength, as Michelle said. And in addition, we put enormous resources over the course of the Cold War into studying the Russians, the Kremlin's mindset, what they're likely to do, deterrence, how that would work. We have not put that amount of effort, I don't think, into the Chinese, and we need to. And obviously, we need the best and the brightest to help us do that. I would just also say, back to our get something done that we can all agree on point. On immigration, it's going to be hard to solve all of those issues, but we came really close a couple of years ago to broadening out the number of people who we educate who could stay in this country. As just one example. And so looking for some of those ways to start to have an immigration system that makes sense for our economy, for our national security. I think there's some potential here that could also be some of those, let's do what we can agree on, even if we're going to disagree about some other things.
Yeah. Any more? Over here? And if you could quickly introduce yourself and also.
Hi there, Chase Stewart, Army G2 ISR Task Force. Had a question. We talked about scaling problem with the Pentagon and getting more funding to tech companies. So just wanted to know if there's any plans to change the way this kind of stuff is funded, getting over the valley of death specifically. It's something that I work on, trying to get that technology through. So at that the strategic, very high level, what any kind of changes coming through, way to accelerate funding, any way to differently allocate funds for tech, obviously continuing resolutions, POM funding, budgeting, all cause issues.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I would say that, to start with, giving credit where credit is due, the department has gotten much better at scouting for technologies, finding technologies to prototype and develop and kind of try out. But the challenge has been, moving those through to full-scale production and so forth. I think there are some pilot projects starting in the Pentagon to try to look at bridge funding, if Congress will agree, to help fund some of the continued development of the technologies until they become programs of record. And so there are some good pilot efforts being made. My personal view is that it's just not enough. It's not going to be at scale or fast enough, and that what we really need to do is create a separate acquisition approach for commercial technologies. Because if you try to run it through the military system, which spends years up front defining requirements, years, competing bids, years going through this waterfall of milestones, it just doesn't work with most of these technologies which have an agile development process and which are going to keep evolving even after procurement and need updates and so forth. So for truly commercial systems, I'd love to see a set of authorities that allow us to acquire them in a different way, and train acquisition professionals and incent them to, in that new approach, to really understand that. Because right now, our acquisition professionals see this as very high risk in terms of, high risk of failure, high risk to your career, why would I want to do that? And so a lot of the wonderful authorities that people like Representative Thornberry put in place for the department aren't really being used fully because people aren't incented to use them and they're afraid to use them. So I really think we need to, at this point, given the urgency, actually create a separate acquisition stream that's specifically for commercial technologies, which is most of the IT and digital stuff we're talking about, and train and incent a cadre within the acquisition corps to do just that and be expert at that. So that's what I would say. I would love to see the department go down that road.
And I'd agree that a lot of the challenge is cultural now, as well as budgetary. On that front, there's a couple of hopeful signs. There is a very small warfighter fund that the appropriators put into this appropriation bill, which doesn't have a lot of money, but it's that flexible funding kind of approach that is a hopeful start, and I think that they may be intending to grow it as it succeeds. Secondly, there is a commission that's been appointed to examine and propose reforms to the whole Pentagon budgeting process that McNamara brought in. So it's about time, you might say, but at least it's being looked at. But I guess my bottom line is I think what Michèle has laid out is exactly right. It's just a matter of common sense. You can't buy a tank and an aircraft carrier the same way you buy software. There's got to be a different approach, one that moves at commercial speed, and that sense of urgency that we've talked about a couple of times is the key thing that means you probably have to have a different authority to move out, because we need to keep working on revising what we got, but it's not going to be improved fast enough to meet the pace that the Chinese and others are setting for us.
Joe Piva, retired Army officer. I guess my question is, it's a new kind of warfare, right? Like, so is there a danger in conflating, and even is the DoD the right tool for a war that has no, when you're talking about China, there's no good military option, right? That is an information and economic war almost in its entirety versus a Russia that has force projection and given territorial desires, right? Like, how do we present that to the general public without conflating them in a way that's a little bit dangerous almost?
Yeah. No, and I mean, there's certainly digital modernization components to what we need to do for the military. But to your point, the bigger the battle, if you will, is going to be fought in the information sphere, before there's ever an actual conflict, and hopefully we can deter that conflict. So it speaks to things like we need a true whole of government, whole of nation approach, really, to deter detect, deter, defeat foreign information operations, to get much better at combating disinformation. I've been shocked by some of the statistics I've seen by how much of the media that Americans are reading, that Australians are reading, that Europeans are reading, stemmed from Russian sources like Sputnik. And it's Russian disinformation that gets picked up and rebroadcast in our media outlets. And suddenly you've got Americans, thinking that Russian disinformation about what's happening in Ukraine is real, or in COVID, or whatever the issue is. So that's an area, and that is definitely not a DoD-led thing. That has got to be led by, civilian side of the government. And similarly on the cybersecurity side, I do think that we're making some serious progress in improving the public-private sector collaboration in the 14 different areas of critical infrastructure in this country. The strongest was initially the defense industrial base, the financial sector. Now we're moving post, colonial pipeline hack, into really looking at the energy infrastructure, the grid, and so forth. And I think that the urgency of having experienced some very substantial attacks in cyberspace is really motivating a new level of action and collaboration. We're not there yet, but at least we're focused in the right direction. So I totally agree. This has to be, again, not just a whole of government approach, but really we need the private sector, we need American citizens, we need civic organizations to be part of this, particularly in dealing with disinformation and cyber threats.
And this is kind of part of what I was referring to a while ago when I say we tend to think in silos. And part of it stems from our view that government is limited and should be limited. And so this is their job, and this is the private sector job. And the Russians and the Chinese and others don't really see it that way. They use that whole of nation approach. So we're not going to become like them, but we do have to think differently about what national security is and how we're going to approach it, because they, as I mentioned, they are driving right at the heart of our democracy to try to divide us further. They don't really care which side of the issues you're on. As long as we're divided, they benefit. And so we're going to have to think, and I agree, DOD is not the answer to everything, and if we try to make DOD the answer to everything, they will become less competent for the things we really need them to. But at the same time, you got to get the other parts of government on a higher plane in dealing with these things. There's been meager attempts in Congress over the years to try to reorganize government agencies, and so forth. I don't know. It would take so much time and effort. I don't see a short to mid-term solution other than leadership from the White House in focusing on the economic, the information, the military, the diplomatic, all of these domains that the other nations are able to integrate easier than we are.
And if I could just give you one example, we tend to do really much better in crisis, and then once the crisis is over, we kind of revert to our bureaucratic behaviors. But I'll give you an example. In the Ukraine, a lot of people have said, well, why hasn't there been have we seen more Russian cyber activity in the Ukraine crisis? And the truth is, there's a lot that's been going on, and one great example of that public-private cooperation, and I believe this has been reported now. I know this has been reported because that's how I read it. You had a situation where Russia used some malware that would be like wiping or erasing files of key institutions in Ukraine. They deployed the malware. Our government detected it, shared the effect with Microsoft, and within 4 hours, Microsoft was able to develop a patch that went out to everybody in the Ukrainian government, so that malware became ineffective before it could spread. That is a classic example of public-private cooperation that actually has real impact on the ground. We need that not just in crisis or war. We need that every single day because we're under constant attack in this country through cyber.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Smalley of Cyberscoop. I have a question about NSPM 13. Recently there was a lot of press around defense losing some of its cyber ops authorities insofar as other agencies were kind of brought back into the process in a way they hadn't been since the Trump administration changed things in 2018. So I was just wondering if either of you have a reaction to that, or think Cyber Command is able to move as nimbly as it needs to. Some of the people I spoke with on those stories, like Ambassador Bolton, suggested that it's really going to hamstring Cyber Command not to be able to just move as quickly as it did before.
Yeah, I would just say I think it was a tremendous success to devolve some of the authority for making cyber decisions down to the military. Because if you have every sort of decision go up to the NSC and they debate the loss and the risk and all of this stuff, you will never move at the appropriate speed to deal with cyber. So clearly, from a military standpoint, well, I'll say one other example I think was a tremendous success. If you compare the 2016 election and the 2020 election, it's a tremendous difference in the Russian ability to get their disinformation into the American public eyes and ears. So you got to be able to move at the appropriate speed. I don't know the details of this order and whether that is too much or whether it goes back to the days where everything seemed to go to the NSC, but you got to move at the appropriate speed when it comes to cyber operations, or they'll be completely ineffective.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also have to think about a more coherent and cohesive interagency approach, because a lot of times we're now seeing foreign adversaries using U.S.-based servers to launch attacks, and there are and should be real limits for what our intelligence and military operators can do domestically inside the United States. And so I think, I look back to some of the most effective interagency organizations. I'll give you two examples. One was back in the, Bush and Clinton administrations, the Joint Interagency Task Force for Countering Drug Trafficking. You had you had the Coast Guard and the military and all of the civilian agencies, pooling authorities, coordinating activities, common operational picture, working together day in, day out at the operational level. We had something similar in counterterrorism, National Capital Region Joint Counterterrorism Task Force, that again brought all the intel folks, the FBI, law enforcement, DHS, DOD, state, everybody who needed Treasury needed to be involved, pooling authorities, pooling intelligence, and coming up with common approaches to attack the problem in real time. We need something like that in cyber, where we're getting out of these silos, put it all together, have people working shoulder by shoulder, day in, day out, and building the trust and building the operational concepts to move at the speed that we need to move, and yet, make sure we have the right policy and legal guardrails in place to not violate our own values or laws.
My name is Shirley Marty Hargis. I'm non-resident fellow at Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and Digital Forensic Research Lab. I have two questions. Speaking to, some of Valerie's points about the people-to-people approach, how can we move forward from, I know there's a lot of discussion about the China Initiative, and thankfully, that's where it's at now. But I would say the China Initiative was more of a mindset that can show up easily in different aspects. So my first question is, how do we address those concerns in such a way that Asian Americans feel safe to be able to help with the security aspects? Because no matter how long I've lived in China and Taiwan, I don't know all of the idioms. And there was an issue online last year. Gosh, I wish I remembered the idiom, but it was mistranslated, and it seemed like it was China's going to get us tomorrow. And then there was a lot of talk from Asian Americans saying, no, actually, this is what it means. It's not speaking to attack. My second question is when we're talking about the global South. I'm first generation American. My parents are from Ghana, and many times as I've spent the years, you know, in the China space, Taiwan space, etc., nuanced things such as, you know, maybe in America, you know, we'll forget the country part, but, you know, a vice president meeting a president of a country on the continent, things like that can soil the people-to-people connection that we could be building. So I know we're speaking about cyber, et cetera, but down to that cultural level that you were mentioning, both of you were speaking to,
Yeah.
how can we address that now so that when we are at the point where we can find an alternative to, you know, other countries seeking China out for their communications networks, et cetera, that we've already, you know, laid a really good foundation?
Well, let me take the first point, and I think it's incumbent upon American leaders in and outside of government to communicate with the American people that, you know, the Chinese people are not our enemy. Our problem is with the Chinese Communist Party and the autocratic rule, the government of China, and the way it's behaviors. You know, it's oppression at home, it's violation of human rights at home, it's coercion and aggression abroad. And so I think, you know, we have to have a sort of dialogue with the American people about there is, you know, where is really the problem? I also think this has to be addressed at the community and grassroots level. You've got to have dialogues at the community level so people can tell their story, so that people aren't sort of broad-brushed with, you know, sort of racist views or assumptions. So I think we have a lot of work to do. This is an area I'm worried about, because the more we do focus on China as a competitor that we're trying to keep from becoming a true adversary or enemy through various means, but you know, a lot of people want more of a black and white. Are they an enemy or are they not? And if they're, you know, and if they're an enemy, then fine. Then anybody who looks like they could be from China, I'm going to be suspicious of, which is just not the answer for our country. It's the opposite of what we need to do in terms of leveraging, you know, people with linguistic and cultural and just other broader talents. I mean, I appreciated just your explaining the idiom of crouching. I can't count how many times my kids and I have watched that film and I never knew the meaning of the idiom. So, you know, there's your contribution right there. But the point is, you know, I am worried about this aspect. I also just will say one last thing on the China point. However intense this competition is, another thing that worries me is there's no room for cooperation right now, politically. And we have areas where we have to politically cooperate with China. Climate change, preventing the next pandemic, preventing proliferation from North Korea, for example. There are no kidding, you know, vital national security interests that we have that we cannot achieve or protect without some level of cooperation with China. We have got to figure out, you know, how to integrate that into our policy. And I know the administration has tried, and, you know, God bless John Kerry, who's over there just constantly trying to work with the Chinese. But right now, the Chinese government has said, no, everything's connected to everything. You want cooperation, we're going to use that as leverage and not give it to you until you give us something else. That is a recipe for ending up in a very bad place in things like climate.
I agree. I would just add, in addition, I referred earlier to updating our export laws. Are there Chinese investors who want to invest in companies in the United States in order to steal the technologies and take it? Yes. So we need to be smarter about that. We also need to be smarter about our counterintelligence capabilities. Yeah. Not everybody that looks us, I agree completely with Michelle, you can't go on looks. Do they try to send spies over here? Well, of course they do. So do the Russian, you know, all sorts of people. So but we are really behind in using the more updated methods of trying to sort through that. On your second point, I think person-to-person contact, leader to leader or otherwise, is just as important when it comes to the digital aspect as it is to other aspects. Because what we started out talking about and what the third way paper talks about is these are two competing systems here. And we want to show people that we're interested in them and help persuade them that our system is a better one for them and their future and their lives. So I think the Biden administration has done a very good job of engaging more with the world. We need to show up, and they've done a much better job of that, which is very important. If you've got some harsh things to say it behind closed doors. You don't have to say it in front of the camera. But showing up and smiling, and shaking hands in front of the camera is a very big help.
And with that, I think we're ready to move on to our panel session. So everyone, please thank our wonderful speakers, Matt Thornberry and Michèle A.